There is a huge history to the endometrial receptivity array, and I want to kind of come clean about this because I was involved with it as well to some extent in the early stages. So in Chicago was the first time I heard about this at a conference, excuse me, called the Midwest Reproductive Symposium. And the Midwest Reproductive Symposium is a great little conference put together by several key players in the Chicago area, including Angie Beltzos, who's instrumental in putting that meeting together. So Angie, if you are watching at any point in time, thank you for everything you do. So at that conference, they brought some people from Spain, and they were from this original company called IVI, which is this huge juggernaut IVF corporation in Spain. And they had developed this test where they used this specific sort of metabolic and protein and hormone profiling of the endometrium to determine whether the lining of the uterus was what they called receptive or pre-receptive or post-receptive. And receptive meant that was the right time to put in the embryo. Pre-receptive meant you needed more exposure to progesterone. And post-receptive, which was extremely rare, by the way, meant you'd already had too much exposure to progesterone. So if you're receptive, you would transfer after 5 days of progesterone. If you were pre-receptive, you needed an extra day of progesterone. So the presentation was quite convincing. They talked about people who had failed. They ran this test on them. They went ahead and did the transfer and they got pregnant. And then they also talked about women with really thin endometrium, and they ran this test on them, found out they were receptive, and they went ahead and did the test. So to me, this made a lot of sense. It sounded really great. Let's test the endometrium. No one's done this before. Let's see if it works. And I jumped into it. So we started doing it on our patients, and initially it kind of seemed like it was helping, but not always. So we thought, well, maybe it's fixing it in some cases, maybe it isn't in other cases. And over time, we started seeing some discrepancies, and we couldn't necessarily get everybody's window of implantation to be quite right, or when we would and we would transfer, it still wouldn't work, even when we had genetically normal embryos. So it wasn't making a ton of sense. So we kind of started drifting away from it after a while, and then I started realizing this really doesn't look like it's working. So I went into the actual studies, and the very first few studies that had come out on this actually showed no benefit. So as those of you who watch our show know, when we reviewed this about a month and a half, 2 months ago, we looked at the actual trial that was run by iGenomics, the now parent company of the ERA test. And they ran an actual randomized controlled trial evaluating the utility of doing the endometrial receptivity, and their own trial showed no benefit to using the test. So despite this, I still see every day on social media or patients that are coming to us for a second opinion that they've been told that they need to do the endometrial receptivity array, and it's an expensive test. Our cost on doing the test was about $1,200, and we were charging $1,250 to do it. So we were charging $50 extra to run the test. It was about $750 for iGenomics, and our cost for doing ultrasounds and lab work and so on was several $100s. So altogether, it was quite a pricey test. So, we didn't want to do it if it wasn't making sense to do it. And so, I kind of shied away, and then that study came out and it said, this really doesn't work. So I said, okay, we're done now. Unless someone has a really thin lining that we cannot thicken, and I'm only looking to see if it's receptive, not for timing purposes, because I don't believe in their timing data at all, but I wanted to see if, it's actually useful just to determine, yes, we can do it, or no, we can't. So despite all of this information that we're sharing with you guys as well, people are still doing this test. So I thought, you know what, maybe we should dive deeper into this and see if there are specific subgroups that benefit or don't benefit. So I pulled up 5 different articles to share with you guys tonight, and I'm going to exclude one article that's very, very small. It had 20 patients, which did show a benefit. So disclaimer, there is one study out there that shows a benefit, but it's only done on about 20 patients, which is not really valid numbers for these kinds of comparisons and to make good decisions on. So the first study is called Routine Endometrial Receptivity Array in First Embryo Transfer Cycles. does not improve live birth rate. So what's the first question? Well, the people from iGenomics claim that 17% of all patients have a displaced window of implantation, meaning you're going to be naturally pre-receptive or post-receptive during a hormonally stimulated cycle in preparation for an embryo transfer. So as a result, they said maybe it's better if we just screen everybody, because if roughly 1 in 6 are out of whack or out of kilter, then it's better to do it on everybody and you're getting 1 in 6 extra. So these guys actually studied this. And this is from the University of California, Wayne State School of Medicine, which is where I did my fertility fellowship, and the Reproductive Partners Medical Group in Redondo Beach. So some great people involved in all this, and they've all analyzed the data. So what did they do? They looked at 228 Euploid frozen embryo transfers. So these are embryo transfers using genetically normal embryos. And they said 147 or 64.5% were ERA and personalized embryo, that's what the little P stands for, personalized embryo transfer cycles, and 81 or 35.5% were just standard cycles. So they gave them 5 days of progesterone and then they transferred it in. The rest of them they transferred in based on whatever the ERA test said. So it might have been 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, whatever was dictated by the testing. So what they concluded was the live birth rate did not differ between patients who underwent frozen embryo transfer with standard timing and patients who underwent endometrial receptivity array personalized embryo transfer, with 56.6% in the standard cycle getting pregnant and having a live birth versus 56.5%. So it is a 0.1% difference, and that 0.1 is actually in favor of not doing the test. So right from the get-go, if you apply this to just everybody and they have euploid embryos, it does not benefit you. And this is a live birth study, which again is the holy grail of all things fertility. Anytime you want to see the best outcome, you want to see what the live birth rates are. So in this study, and you can flip through it if you like, they did not show any benefit to doing the endometrial receptivity array. And if you go through clinical pregnancy rate, if you go through positive HCG, even if you go through miscarriage rate, they show absolutely no statistically significant difference between any of those outcomes. So number one, does it work if it's an unscreened population? It does not. So that element is useless. So that's one nail in the coffin from our little post in preparation for tonight's show. So the next study is called, does the endometrial receptivity array really provide personalized embryo transfers? So the question was, does it actually make a difference? Are you really getting a personalized transfer, and is it really making a difference for you? So this study looked at 503 patients. It does involve Bob Casper, who's a brilliant Canadian fertility specialist. He's invented half of the birth control pills are out there. And is really one of the forefathers of infertility, extremely intelligent guy. So 503 patients in the control group compared to 41 patients who had the personalized embryo transfer with the endometrial receptivity array. So they looked at all the elements ahead of time to see if age, number of previous transfers, endometrial thickness, number of transferred embryos, and ongoing pregnancy rates were any different between the two groups. So these guys went through a little bit of additional trouble. They made sure that everything was perfect. The groups were lined up. They were lined up. So you got two equivalent groups. Different sizes, admittedly, but they're equivalent in terms of the percentages of all these different things. So what they looked at was, again, whether the patients had a difference or not. And they said that the women in the study group with pre or post-receptive endometrium on ERA testing, after getting the appropriate adjustment in timing for their frozen embryo transfer according to the ERA result, got a 33.3% pregnancy rate, which was 2% less than the 35.2% rate that the patients that did not get the endometrial receptivity array test got. So basically, and I won't go through all of the details of the study to bore you. You can see them up there on the screen. These patients had the exact same success, no statistically significant difference, no clinically significant difference, other than that it was actually a tiny bit lower when you use the ERA versus not using the ERA. So nail number 2. The third study is called Evaluation of the Endometrial Receptivity Array and the Preimplantation Genetic Test for Aneuploidy in overcoming recurrent implantation failure. So maybe there's hope for this test in the patients that have failed multiple times. What if you've had a bunch of embryo transfers? It didn't work. There's got to be something wrong. Let's figure out what that is. So people have thought maybe that's the endometrial receptivity array. So this is a huge study looking at 2,110 patients with moderate recurrent implantation failure. And they also had a significant number with severe, 488 patients with severe recurrent implantation failure. So moderate meant they had failed 3 previous embryo transfers, and severe meant they had failed 5 previous embryo transfers. So they went through these studies and they looked at the different groups, and they said that the PGTA analysis, meaning doing genetic testing to determine if your embryos are normal or not, is useful in reducing the recurrent implantation failure rates and increasing your success rates. But when they looked at the utility of doing the endometrial receptivity array, either on its own or in conjunction with the pre-implantation genetic testing, it showed no benefit. So I'll just share some numbers, and these aren't up on the screen, but I just want to go through them with you. So the standard, which was just garden variety, in the moderate group had a 35.9% ongoing pregnancy rate, and the severe had a 34% ongoing pregnancy rate. What does that mean? If you did nothing, you didn't get PGTA, you didn't get anything personalized, no ERA, no PGTA, you still had a 1/3 chance of getting pregnant. So reasonable. If you did the endometrial receptivity array, instead of 35.9, it was 36.25 in the moderate, and instead of 34 in the severe, it was 40% in the severe, but not statistically significantly different. If you did pre-implantation genetic testing, that gave you a 45.9% in the moderate and 36.1% in the severe, which they did say was statistically significant. And if you did PGT plus ERA, it actually brought down your chances. So you got 33.3% in the moderate, and you got 33.3% in the severe, compared to 45.9% for just doing the pre-implantation testing and 36%. So anywhere from a 3 to 12% decrease by adding in the results of the ERA. So again, when you have recurrent implantation failure, it doesn't help you. That is yet another nail in the coffin of the endometrial receptivity array. The next study was called The Role of the Endometrial Receptivity Array in Patients Who Have Failed Euploid Transfers. So what if you've just failed genetically tested embryos? And the question is, does it help in those instances when you've transferred these, but you failed the transfer of your genetically tested embryos? So you know they're euploid, you're putting them in, it's not working. So this was a smaller study. They looked at 88 patients who underwent the ERA testing, and they compared the outcomes. So this is from a wonderful group in New Zealand, and one of the guys involved is well known. So when they looked at this study, they said of the patients with at least one previously failed euploid frozen embryo transfer, 22.5% had a displaced window of implantation and qualified for this personal embryo transfer. So that's actually 1 in 4, 1 in 5 instead of just the 1 in 6. So they said that after the embryo transfer, they did find the rates were higher when you use the endometrial receptivity array. So this one's kind of an outlier. 73.7 versus 54.2 and 63.2 versus 41.7 for implantation and ongoing pregnancy. But there was no statistically significant difference. And this study isn't up on the screen for you guys, but I wanted to share this with you. It's saying the percentages are higher, but it wasn't statistically significant, which means even though you see higher numbers, it doesn't mean anything. They're not actually legitimately showing a difference. The final study is by a group from Spain, I believe, and it's what is the clinical impact of the endometrial receptivity array when, again, you've done genetic testing, and this time they even looked at egg donor cycles. So some people would say, well, it's not really harmful, I can afford it, let me make sure. Here's some interesting data for you. So there was no difference in implantation or pregnancy rate in the euploid, meaning genetically normal embryos, with the ERA versus the euploid non-ERA tested. The numbers, again, there's no statistically significant difference, but in this study, they actually favor not doing the ERA. So it was 58.3% for the ERA group and 70.6% for the standard group. But when they did this on the egg donors, it actually was statistically significant, and it's lower when you do the endometrial receptivity array. So it was 26.8% if you're tested with the ERA and 41.4% if you are not tested. That's implantation, and ongoing pregnancy was 34.4% when you have been tested with the ERA versus 65.2% when you have not been. So almost close to double the success rate if you don't use the ERA and you're using an egg donor. So for those of you who are using an egg donor, please do not do an endometrial receptivity array. It will actually decrease your chances, almost cutting them in half. And that was a highly statistically significant finding. So is there any utility to doing the endometrial receptivity array? I actually believe there is, and that one and only time is when you get a patient whose lining is so thin, nothing you do works, and you just want to see if they can be receptive or not. Because they will tell you that it is not receptive. Sometimes they can tell you pre, post receptive, and then sometimes they just say not receptive. So if you get a really thin endometrium where nothing you do works, it's probably usable there to tell that patient, listen, I'm not sure this will work at all in you. Forget the timing issue, we just can't get your endometrium ready. But for everybody else, PGT tested, non-PGT tested, recurrent implantation failure, first time, multiple previous untested failures, it does not work. And I can tell you from personal correspondence with the main guy at iGenomics that he once tried to tell me that it showed a benefit, quoting a study that actually showed no benefit. So I am 100% opposed to people doing this because it does not help and it doesn't make a difference. So don't bother wasting your time with the ERA test. I fell for it hook, line, and sinker. My apologies to those that did it with us earlier on. It made a lot of sense and we went for it, but as the new studies are showing more and more as time goes on, there is absolutely zero benefit to doing this test, so don't bother. So is it a fact or a fiction that the endometrial receptivity array can help you? It is a fiction. It does not help. Do not waste your money. And I'd actually discourage you from displacing your normal protocol using this because it can actually reduce your success rates if you do. So thanks so much for joining. Make sure you like, comment, and share on the website, and definitely subscribe to our YouTube channel where all of our videos are posted after the show. And if you have any questions or comments, we would love to hear them. Let us know what you think. If you did something that was different from what we see here, we'd love to hear about it and we want to know about that.